In the last episode of Green Jobs Africa, we took time to review the kind of jobs that are there, that are emerging, the core jobs that are coming up in the various sectors. And then we began to break down different sectors and the kinds of jobs that you could be looking out for, or you should be looking out for if you're interested in transitioning into green jobs. So in this episode, we'll get to review exactly what jobs are there in the agricultural space and why it's a large or huge employer, especially for the young people that are on the continent that are largely unemployed. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So the agricultural sector is one of the largest emitters when it comes to carbon emissions, and that's alongside the other sectors that we've discussed, highlighting as high emitters, which is transport, energy, industry, and building. Africa is home to the largest arable land in the world, and that means that if we do play our cards right, we could actually be feeding the world. But there are a couple of complications when it comes to that strategy, and we'll be delving into that in a little bit. What we do need to know about agriculture and why it's one of the highest emitting or emitters in terms of sectors is that it boils down back to the issue of the soil. And this is based on the different practices that we practice or implement when it comes to growing food or just the complexity of the biodiversity. For the most part, African land is owned by small-scale holder farmers. And this means that there's a lot of fragmentation in terms of farming. And that means that for the most part, there's no consistency when it comes to the crops that are grown or just the methods that are applied or methods that are used when it comes to production of food. And so when it comes to degenerative, or it results to degenerative activities such as, over-tilling or over-cultivation of the soil, deforestation, and many other practices when it comes to management of the crops that result to erosion of the value or the nutrients that are in the soil and its capacity or capability when it comes to sequestering carbon. So in view of that, you find that in many cases there's a need, because of the kind of practices that we've adopted over time, there's a need for us to go back and begin to make the corrections. And that means things like changing our management practices, the kind of crops that we grow, how long we grow them, how often we grow them. Even in the Bible, there are moments when the farmers were asked to allow the land to rest for a while because that's a way that it's able to regenerate. It's called regenerative agricultural practices. And there are ways in which we can restore the ability of the soil to sequester carbon. But then you'd probably be asking, what exactly are the jobs then that are in this sector? There's a lot of push right now, especially on the African continent, when it comes to climate smart agriculture. And that basically means the knowledge or the practices that are more modern or more favorable to the management, especially of the soil and the crop. And so how then would you, as a young person who is in Africa and thinking, I'm not interested in agriculture, or I am interested in agriculture, but where exactly do I start from? And so before we get into the kind of jobs that you would be able to engage in if you're a young person that's interested in agriculture, there are a couple of facts that we do need to know, especially facts that affect the continent. The first one, like I said, is that we are home to the largest arable land, which means we have huge capacity when it comes to production of food. The second one is that we are significantly affected by climate change in this context, meaning that there's a lot of post-harvest losses or just loss of crops for the most part because of the floods and the rains that are not consistent because of the changing weather patterns due to climate change. And that means that over time, then the farmers are not able to reap the most that they can. And even when they do, it then results to post-harvest losses because there are no structures or mechanisms in place to make sure that even when the crops are harvested, they're able to be kept for a long time. The other fact that you need to know is that close to 60 to 80% of the smallholder farmers or farm managers are actually women, which means that any intervention that happens in the climate smart agriculture or in the future applications of trying to change the sector towards a more climate resilient sector, it means that the women would either benefit or not benefit. So it has a direct implication on gender, especially for those of us that are interested in the question of gender. So these are just some of the things that we need to know so that when we come back to interventions or jobs or areas that we need to look at in terms of jobs, then you're looking at what are the specific nuances that affect Africa that we could be looking to address when it comes to the jobs. Because sometimes It's not necessarily in the direct planting, for example, in this sector. It could be the other areas that are externalities, as they're called, that are implications of any interventions that would be then put in place. An example is data. One of the things that we have suffered or consistently had concerning the continent of Africa is the lack of data. And so anyone who gets into the data space to be able to analyze what exactly are the challenges, what crops are doing well in which areas. You might think that we know that, especially after hundreds or a couple of years of having grown certain crops, but it does not have to have a repository of data through which we can use to make policies or change our farm practices or see what's exactly working and what's not working. One of the other causes of degenerative agriculture or degenerative practices is the use of pesticides. And this is where synthetic pesticides are used in the crops, which means they're harmful not just to the crops and not just to the soil, but also to the health. So anyone who's getting into the climate space, again, there could be that point of research around what kind of pesticides are used. And this could be available, but then there's a way that it needs to now be communicated, not just to the policymakers, but also to the farmers. So that's another place that you could get into if you're interested in climate smart agriculture. Another one could be, what are the mechanisms, especially when it comes to agro-processing? We have significant post-harvest losses in Africa because, like I said, we do not have the mechanisms to be able to support ourselves when it comes to sustaining the food and achieving food security, because of making sure that we increase the shelf life of crops and food when it's already been harvested. For example, there are regions that are maybe highest producers of, say, rice or very perishable crops like tomatoes that then require not just the inputs that would enable increased production, but there's a support system, post-harvest support systems or infrastructure that would allow for making sure that those crops, the shelf life of those crops are increased. In this case, you could look at cold storage, for example, or other agro-processing, maybe a value addition when it comes to crops. And those are areas that many young people should get in, especially those that are not interested in the actual tilling of the farm, because that's a whole value chain that could be a significant contributor when it comes to food security on the continent. Another area that one could look at is, like I say, data. And in this case, there are companies now or organizations that are using AI to be able to know and to match weather patterns, like early warning systems, for example, in making sure that farmers know exactly what the challenges are in terms of expectation, in terms of weather, and how that's going to address or how that's going to impact their production. There are many ways in which young people can get into the agricultural space. And when it comes to the climate smart agriculture, there are many new ways that are coming up. Even the mechanization or the kind of insurance, for example, there are insurance products that are now being created to enable farmers to be able to produce a lot more of the crops without necessarily thinking about the cost of the inputs. Inputs is another area, for example, and not just inputs that are artificial, but inputs that are organic, especially when it comes to the farm, in terms of animal husbandry, as well as the crops themselves. There's a lot of inputs that are required. Fertilizer. One of the things that I mentioned when we were speaking about the energy section in terms of new jobs that are coming up is the green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is a good source of ammonia, or can be used to produce ammonia, which is a critical component of fertilizer. And so anyone who, again, would be interested in the fertilizer space, that's a huge opportunity right there when it comes to organic fertilizer. We're working with some young people who are doing amazing stuff when it comes to waste management. And waste management in terms of especially food waste management, because that's one of the ways in which you can transform food waste into organic fertilizer. And there are a lot of young people that stand a chance to be able to earn quite a bit when it comes to that kind of solutions. Soil is a huge way in which we can restore or decarbonize or achieve our decarbonization targets and goals, but it has to go hand in hand with specific methods that allow it to be regenerated and allow it to be restored every so often, and even during the process of growing the crops. There are many other ways, and you could not just be looking at the land in terms of farming, but there are other ways, like, for example, fish or fishery. There are many other opportunities or areas in the climate smart agriculture space. There are crops that are climate resilient. For example, cassava, sweet potatoes. There's moringa tree, which is an amazing plant that apparently absorbs quite a bit of carbon in and of itself, and then it has so many byproducts as well. well. These are just examples of areas that any young person can get into if they're interested in the climate smart agricultural space. One of the things that we need to remember, especially for the African continent, is that according to the director of WTO, Dr. Ngozi Iweala, she recently said that there is 700 billion that is given in form of agricultural subsidies. And for the most part, this goes towards practices that are degenerative in nature or are anti-climate resilient pathway that we desire to go into. And her proposal in conversations that she's held recently is that 700 billion a year could be translated into helping farmers, actual farmers who are growing and practicing regenerative agriculture and climate smart agriculture to enable them to produce food sustainably. And that is a brilliant idea. And this could be just one of the ways at a global level that could help Africa to be able to achieve its targets. But while we're discussing the global and the macro issues, we still have to be able to come back home and say, what can we do? So you as a young person, whether it's in the waste management space or the agro-processing space or the data space or the climate tech solutions that will address the issue of climate smart agriculture, there are many ways in which you can play a role. And remember that agriculture is not going anywhere, because for as long as man is on the earth, they will have to feed, or we will have to feed. And so it's a huge opportunity. And one of my personal recent discoveries, especially in the last 2 years, was that for example, in Kenya, over 70% of the young people actually reside in the rural areas. And so when it comes to creation of employment or addressing the issue of unemployment, most of these rural areas are largely agrarian. For Kenya, for example, 30% of our GDP is banked on agriculture. We cannot run away from agriculture being a source of employment. So whether you're in the policy space, in the research space, I know there are many organizations that are focused on agriculture in particular, but we do have to find ways in which we can engage more young people in the climate smart agriculture space, especially women, because they're already in that space. But even as we create interventions, they have to be gender sensitive, but they also have to be youth-centric, because if 70% of the young people on this continent reside in rural areas, then that's the way that we need to go when it comes to enticing them to get into the agricultural space by marketing it accurately to them on the one part, but also being able to address issues like land rights, issues like cultural practices that inhibit especially women from owning land or being able to practice, certain kinds of agriculture. There are many ways in which we could address the issue of climate smart agriculture in order for us to be able to address the issue of unemployment. In Jacob's Ladder Africa, we believe that we have to be able to be strategic as a continent. We have to be able to look at what are these sectors that will trigger millions of jobs, because we do have millions that are unemployed, and that number is only rising every single day. And so climate smart agriculture remains top of the agenda and top of mind. And we do hope that that we're not just discussing it, or we're not just looking at it as an opportunity, but we are strategically approaching ways in which that we can address the challenge of unemployment using climate smart agriculture. So there you have it. If you are interested in agriculture, I hope you've been a bit more informed about what you can do and how you can position yourself. And perhaps you're a young person and you're thinking, okay, I didn't study agriculture, I'm not interested in agriculture, but I'm convinced, or you're convinced that this could be an area for you. Where do you start from? To answer you could start from this. Do a bit of research. Like I said, you could find, I personally believe that you need to do something that you're passionate about and genuinely interested in. And so if you're looking for a job, in a green job in the climate smart agricultural space, we've said, don't just look at the farm, don't just look at animals, don't just look at the inputs, for example, look at the whole value chain. Look at the different value chains. There's certain kinds of practices, or there's certain kinds of value chains that don't necessarily require a lot of, the engagement with the farm and all that. For example, fishery, like I mentioned, or beekeeping. There are other ways in which you can practice agriculture. But like I said, down the value chain, there's also the issue of the value addition. So that's something else that you could look at. But one of the things that we know, based on research and based on practice, is that any agricultural program that needs to address the issue of youth unemployment in the agricultural space needs to look at the issue of offtake. so that as the input is being increased, there's a guaranteed offtake, which means that you have supermarkets that are waiting for the honey, you have supermarkets that are waiting for the fish, or buyers that are waiting for the fish, or hotels that are waiting for the fish, or whatever other produce is coming from the farm. It's one of the ways we will make sure that we're not just doing activity, but that the activity that the young people are engaged in the various programs results into an actual income that is sustainable in every sense of the word. So there you have it. If you are young, African, and interested in agriculture or climate smart agriculture in terms of green jobs in this space, there are many ways in which you can engage, and there are many ways in which you can participate or get involved. So please do a bit of digging, do a bit of research, get engaged or get involved with especially youth agribusiness groups that are focused on agriculture in specific areas, and that could be one of the ways that you could fast track your process in getting into this space. If you do need any additional information or support, or maybe you're wondering, you're doing this project on your own and you're wondering, how do I partner? How do I get support, for example? Feel free to write to us and we could try our level best to point you in the right direction or to help you. So thank you very much for joining me today, and for all the agriculture enthusiasts or future enthusiasts. I hope you've learned something and you're encouraged and you've gotten a few facts that have helped you or will help you to enable you to position in this space. If you do have questions, comments, please feel free to send them to us or make your comments in the comment section below, and we'll be able to answer your questions or point you in the right direction should you need information or just get to know what exactly is going on out there and how do you position yourself to benefit, especially from organizations that are looking for young people who are able or who are interested in the agricultural space. We could do that for you. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.